And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. And for those of you who are just joining us for the first time tonight, I would like to remind you that you can catch Truth on the Tracks every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on ucy.tv. You can access the show's personal page at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And on that page, you will find the RSS feed for my articles, essentially the links to my articles as they're posted up on BrandonTurbeville.com, and you'll find the archive versions of this show to the left on left-hand side of your screen on that page. If you tune in to the radio show, as you're doing tonight, you can join in the chat room, which is also on the show's personal page. If you don't mind joining in discussion, there's lots of good people in there, especially as this show is broadcast, that you can engage in conversation. Lots of like-minded individuals there. Now, I am also a staff writer for activistpost.com, and you can keep up with my work there on that website as it comes out in real time. But you can also go to the Contributors tab, find my name under Staff Writers, and click on my name, and that will carry you to my article archive page. You can see all the work that's been posted on that website there. You can also check out some of the work that may be coming out soon in the antimedia.org and progressivegazette.com, because I'm a contributor to those websites as well, and occasionally do the original articles, exclusive articles for those sites as well. But if you're just interested in my work specifically, then I would recommend that you go to BrandonTurbeville.com. That is the web page that I repost all of my articles, all of the archive versions of this show, all of my interviews, all of the relevant information at that web page. And you can also find a link to my books. If you just click on the Books tab, you'll go to the bookstore. It's very easy to use and to look at, to shop. You can also click on the contact tab and send me an email if you want at anticodex@yahoo.com. Now, before I begin the show, the last couple of weeks I had been plugging an event that I was going to take part in. I was going to present a vaccine lecture about the dangers of vaccinations in Mullen, South Carolina, at Coffee, etc. That event has now come and gone, and I'm pleased to announce that it was a successful event. We had a great turnout. The venue was packed, standing room only. It was a small place, but still a standing room only crowd. And we had a great discussion. It lasted about an hour. We had a question and answer segment, and we had an extended chat after the official talk. Right, we were there for quite a while, a couple of hours, discussing these issues that are so important. So, a good job of Coffee, etc., for putting this together and having everything just right, and lots of people worked hard to put this event together. So, thanks to them, and hopefully there will be more in the future. Now, the world situation in terms of Syria has disintegrated to some degree, worse than it was only a few weeks ago. And of course, the situation in Ukraine only gets worse and worse. And we're going to talk about that, as well as the fact that the U.S. economy is starting to experience more and more turbulence as we go along. And we're also seeing the U.S. military, along with local law enforcement, gearing up to deal with the ensuing riots and to deal with the dissension that will come as a result of a worsening economy. We're also going to talk about some lessons from the ice-pocalypse, which is the ice storm. I'm sarcastically referring to the ice storm that the South has experienced over the recent weeks, that left many of us without power for upwards of 3 days, some 4 days without power. So we're going to talk about some lessons we learned in terms of preparation and also in terms of what should be done in the future to avoid this kind of thing. Now, I want to make a small caveat about the future of this show before we really get into the information here. And this is just to make sure that the listeners understand that I often have guests on this show, and I've had more guests, I believe, in 2014 already than I had in the entirety of 2013. And that's partly due to better equipment, but it's also due to the fact that there are a number of individuals that I want to bring up and I have brought up that simply are overlooked in the alternative media because either they're not as active in the alternative media itself, they're not getting the attention they need, or they don't have the outlets just yet to speak, but they have something to offer. And I think a lot of these people, not only do they have something to offer, they need to be heard, and that's why I'm going to bring them up on the show. A good example of that is Alan Moore of Aries Tactical Solutions, and he was on the show last week, and we discussed prepping on a budget, and you can find that interview on YouTube. Just type in my name and his and Truth on the Tracks, and that'll come up. You can also go to BrandonTurbeville.com and see the interview there as it's reposted. And Alan and I discussed prepping on a budget, some very practical things that you can do in terms of preparation for emergencies on low budgets. And we also talk about weaponry and self-defense, firearm preferences, and so forth. And he has a wealth of information in that regard, as well as current events. He's very knowledgeable about current events. But he needs to be heard, and I'm proud to have him on the show for the second time, and I hope lots of people have tuned in for that show. There are going to be other people. Again, I had Daniela Walls and Kyle McCarthy of the United Front Against Austerity and Tax Wall Street Party, and these are people that need to be heard and often get overlooked in the alternative media as well, simply because of the heavy libertarian contingent, heavy anarchist contingent in the alternative media, that many of these individuals don't get the airplay that they need. Now, it doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but we should have a healthy discussion here. Now, what I'm going to say about the future of this show, again, I'm going to bring on people who may have been or may be overlooked in the alternative media, or simply people that I know or people that I've heard of that aren't getting the attention they need or haven't had the outlets to speak, but have something to offer. That I'm also going to have some people on who are active and trying to bring out some change into this world and bring about a better place to live. Some people who are actually doing something as opposed to sitting around and criticizing others and telling others how they could do it better while they eat fast food and watch television and do absolutely nothing of consequence and be completely non-productive. So in my experience, and I'm of the opinion that if you're not doing something, you can just shut the hell up when it comes to criticizing others on how they could do it better. If you're not in the fight, then shut up. We don't need any more coaches. We need fighters. So, that in mind, I'm going to bring up some people who have been very active and have put themselves on the line. With that being said, I want the listeners to understand completely, that just because I have someone on this radio show does not mean that I agree with them 100%. I want to make this clear for a number of reasons, right? I'll give you an example. Those of you who've listened to my radio show on a regular basis, who've read my articles, will know that while I agree with many of my libertarian friends on certain issues like the drug war, the surveillance issue, the police state issue, and many domestic issues, when it comes to economics, I absolutely despise libertarian economics, and I despise Austrian school economics. I despise free market economics. I will try to avoid the rant here at this point in the show. But that does not mean that you won't hear a libertarian on this show. In fact, there's a good chance that you will hear a libertarian on this show in the future. And I'm not going to castigate this person for their beliefs. There's a good chance you might hear someone who espouses Marxism, and I am by no means a Marxist. But the fact is, in the alternative media, or it really should be in the media as a whole, we have to absolutely guard ourselves against the tendency to only talk to people that agree with us. For a number of reasons. One, this doesn't provide us with any new information. If we simply sit around and talk about things that we all agree on, and we don't disagree, and we don't discuss those things, and we don't give people an opportunity to air those ideas, and at least put that information out there and let people do with it what they will, then that we're doing ourselves a disservice, we're doing our audience a disservice, and we're doing the movement a disservice. This is what happens in religions, right? People get around in groups and they just talk about things that they agree on. Then it becomes a standardized religion, and nobody can deviate, and it's non-productive, and it's chaining in terms of the mind. So I just wanted to make that clear, that just because you hear someone on this show doesn't mean that I endorse their entire philosophy. That means that either we agree on some things, or that they have something to say that I think people should hear, but it does not necessarily equal an endorsement of what I believe, or it's not an endorsement rather of their beliefs on my behalf. So if you want to know what I think about a certain issue, then you should listen to me give you my opinion on it. But don't assume that future guests are going to, or past guests are going to accurately represent my mode of thought. So, that long-winded caveat out of the way, we need to talk about Syria first. Why don't we take a look at Syria first? We have this situation now due to the relative failure of the Geneva II Peace Conference. The failure of the Geneva II Peace Conference was engineered from the beginning. Remember, Ban Ki-moon sending out an invitation to Iran to join in the peace talks, and then rescinding it after the whining of the United States and the whining of the French. This is the United Nations is clear in terms of what it is. It's nothing but a global government control structure, clear enough. But the idea of its stance and the bias in its stance has never been more obvious. If, as the United States claims, Iran is a party to the conflict, right? All parties to the conflict are supposed to be brought to the peace conference table. Well, the United States, France, Britain, they all claim that Iran is supporting Assad. Well, that would make make Iran a party to the conflict, would it not? If they then are a party to the conflict, then they have an absolute right to be at that peace conference table. Yet that was rejected. So Ban Ki-moon showing his true colors in this instance. Well, the peace talks, of course, have largely they dissolved without any agreements. This is because numerous things, right? This is mainly because the death squads refuse to negotiate, right? The death squads are absolutely insane with their fanaticism and cannot even play politics at a peace conference well enough to buy themselves some time and at least try to make themselves look decent. But we have this we also have the continuation of the Anglo-Americans to fund the death squads. If there's going to be a true ceasefire, if there's going to be a true sitting down of arms and time to talk about the possibility of peace, then immediately the West has to stop funding the terrorists, the jihadists, the mercenaries from operating inside Syria. But of course, they refused to do so. So this is a one-sided talk to begin with. Well, what we hear now is not only a statement of continuation for the funding and arming and training of the death squads inside Syria by the Obama administration and their surrogates, but we also hear that Obama is talking about taking other measures. Right? All options are on the table. Where have we heard this before? This is becoming a common phrase for the American people to hear from their White House. All options are on the table. We are hearing about statements like humanitarian corridors and the responsibility to protect. Well, I want to bring that up in just a second, but first let me point out the idea is that this narrative that I talked about 2 weeks ago on the show, that Assad was funding Al-Qaeda, right? This absurd notion that Assad committed a false flag attack against himself. He funded Al-Qaeda to make the rebels look bad, so public opinion would turn against them and the West would side with Assad. This is ludicrous. The West has been funding Al-Qaeda from the beginning, not just from the beginning of the Syrian conflict, but from the beginning in general. But the West has been funding Al-Qaeda. They know they've been funding Al-Qaeda, and to turn it around on Assad, this is just absolutely absurd. Assad has killed more Al-Qaeda fighters than probably anyone else in the world. That's because Al-Qaeda is fighting Assad. So how in God's name could he fund them and then fight them at the same time? This is not only counterintuitive, it's absolutely stupid, and anybody who could buy into this stuff needs to have their head examined. Now, the West is talking about the danger of terrorists coming back to the West to commit terrorist activities, and they're saying that a lot of these people have already returned back. Well, there's two things I want to say about this. First, what you're seeing is a setup for a false flag attack domestically in the United States, in the Western regions, right, in the Western world. You're already having claims that Al-Qaeda operatives have returned to the United States and to Western Europe, but we don't know where they're at, right, these Al-Qaeda fighters. Maybe they're going to conduct terrorist attacks here domestically. Well, maybe. Well, who should we look at if that occurs? Well, we should look at the people who fund them, which is Western Europe and the United States, right? The British, the French, the United States, the Anglo-American Empire, as Carol Quigley referred to them. If they have returned to the United States, first of all, do you really believe that with all of the surveillance that is taking place right now, with everything monitored, tracked, and traced, that a terrorist fighter has gone to Syria, fought, and come back to the United States or the Western world, and the government simply don't know where they're at? Ladies and gentlemen, you are being set up for a domestic terrorist attack, and this is the backstory. This is the paper trail that's being left for us to follow. Don't buy into it. Now, the idea of the humanitarian corridor and the Al-Qaeda bases, they're claiming that Al-Qaeda has a stronghold in northern Syria. That's true enough. They do have a stronghold in northern Syria because it's on the border of Turkey. Turkey has been instrumental in funneling in the death squads through their borders into northern Syria. This has been one of the most porous borders going into Syria that we could imagine. Erdogan, of course, fell into the trap of believing he was going to be the leader of the Second Ottoman Empire by doing this, and instead he's actually destabilized his own rule inside his own country. This is foolishness to the umpteenth degree. Nevertheless, we have this Al-Qaeda stronghold, this terrorist stronghold in northern Syria, which is now being used as an excuse by the Western powers to justify a possible invasion, military strikes or drone strikes inside Syria to fight Al-Qaeda. They funded Al-Qaeda in Syria and are now using Al-Qaeda as the justification to strike Syria. We have now entered the world of George Orwell fully, where we're at war with East Asia one day, we're not at war with East Asia the next day, and we are at war with East Asia again the day after that, and nobody notices the change. Nobody notices the difference. They all fall right in line as if it had always been that way. We have reached that point now. Of course, most people just simply don't know, couldn't find Syria on a map, and have no idea what Al-Qaeda even is. I keep running across this as well. Most people don't even know what Al-Qaeda is anymore. They just know they should be afraid of it. So this is the situation that we're being faced with. Now, back to the humanitarian corridor and the responsibility to protect. We've seen this many times where claims are made that a minority, or I guess one could say just an ethnic group, is being decimated, or genocide is being committed against them, or some other type of oppressive measure is being leveled at a group of people, the Western world, the United Nations, NATO, and all of their glory always come out and say, we have a responsibility to protect these people. And what they try to do, one of the methods of this responsibility to protect, of course, which is nothing but a cover for military invasion, one of their methods is the humanitarian corridor, meaning these areas, this corridor of areas where there can be no fighting, right? Where essentially there are peacekeepers and the government has no authority over these areas. What has to happen, of course, is that there's no government flights allowed over these areas. Thus, you would have to have a no-fly zone, which is enforced by the military, by NATO, by Western powers, by the United Nations, etc. This is essentially a declaration of war. This is what they did to Gaddafi, right? They declared humanitarian corridors, and they implemented a no-fly zone. This is the most important part of it. They implemented a no-fly zone, which then resulted in the bombing of Gaddafi's aircraft, the bombing of Gaddafi's military equipment, and of course the bombing of the Libyan soldiers themselves. And you know, we all know where it went from there. We actually had special forces on the ground. Gaddafi was assassinated in a very brutal fashion. He was actually sodomized with a bayonet, from what we can tell. So this is the fruits of NATO. But where do we get this responsibility to protect theory from? Well, the first person to use the responsibility to protect, although they did not use these terms, of course, was Adolf Hitler and the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, where the claims were the ethnic Germans were being oppressed, and the Germany proper had a responsibility to protect these individuals. So, it has a long history of being used in this regard. Now, of course, the propaganda narratives don't just end with the insane claims about Al-Qaeda. We recently saw yet another photograph being circulated all the way across the internet, right? And this was the picture of a little boy who was fleeing Syria, a little Syrian boy who's crossing the desert by himself. And this is a very pitiful picture. He's walking across the desert. He's got his little handbag, very small child, and he's alone by himself. And except for the UN workers who have gone over to talk to him and see where his parents are. Very heartbreaking photo. It shows you the travesty of the Syrian situation, right? Well, the photo's not fake per se, but it's doctored, right? When you look at it, it turns out that the boy actually isn't by himself. There was indeed a group of refugees who were trying to cross the border into Syria. And there was sort of I'm sorry, not into Syria, but out of Syria. They're trying to leave Syria and go into Jordan. And there's a number of people trying to cross this border. And in the sort of stampede to get across the border, the boy got separated from his parents. Now, if you look at the photo, once again, this is the similar situation to the fall of Saddam Hussein and the big statue that was pulled down, where it looks like there's thousands and thousands of people out there celebrating, but it's really only like 50. What you see here is this little boy. When you zoom back out, you see that he's not alone at all, that he's in a relatively large group of people. He's actually there with his family. So this is yet another cynical attempt at propaganda to gin up war and sort of, you know, anger at the Assad government, as if it's Assad's fault entirely that these people are fleeing Syria. You want to blame somebody for the Syrian plight, then blame the death squads. In fact, you can blame the West. Don't just blame the death squad. Blame the people who are responsible for them. Now we've got just a couple of other things that I got to mention about Syria. The propaganda regarding starving Syrian people coming out of Yarmouk, coming out of Homs, coming out of a number of different areas, these pictures of emaciated Syrians coming out of the urban areas and the towns and so forth when the civilians are allowed to leave. This is portrayed as if Assad is starving his own people. This is not actually said. Usually it's not actually said, but it's strongly implied, although it has been said before that it's the fault of the Syrian government's blockades against the rebels. Well, there are blockades, but most of those blockades, the overwhelming majority of those blockades, are blockades that are initiated by the death squads. These death squads won't even allow baby formula to come into the areas. Now, why would you not even allow baby formula? These people are cruel. They are cruel for the sake of cruelty, right? So you want to blame people for checkpoints and not allowing food and water and clothing to get into the Syrian people. You blame the death squads for that. You don't blame Assad. Now we've also got to mention we've got these 85 foreign intelligence officers that were arrested by the Syrian government, the Syrian security forces, and this comes from Press TV. This is the source. Well, this Press TV actually has sources as well. Also, the Al Manar Palestinian channel has sources in here as well, and they've been somewhat they've been pretty accurate in the past in these types of things. But most of these intelligence officers that were captured were from Saudi Arabia. Big surprise. They also had 14 Qatari officers, intelligence officers, and 9 Turkish intelligence officers as well. Again, big surprise. These are the nations, of course, that have led the destabilization effort against Syria as a proxy for the West and are continuing to engage in that destabilization program. Now, there's one more thing I want to end up talking about Syria, and then I want to move on to the Ukraine. I want to move on to Ohio, National Guard issues, as well, bring it all back to South Carolina where I'm at in terms of lessons from the ice apocalypse. I want to talk about some prepping issues, as well as the South Carolina law enforcement community working with the U.S. military to raid farmhouses, as well as a couple other things. So we'll get into that, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us. We'll be right back on the other side.
Now to the West, still in the grip of a severe drought where federal water officials are turning off their taps as well. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation announced yesterday that there will be no federal water deliveries this year to most farmers in California's Central Valley. As Carter Evans reports, that's really bad news for a region responsible for half of America's produce.
With 0% water, if we don't have enough water to irrigate this field, this whole system is going to be left dry.
The fields on Joe Del Bosque's farm should be lush with tomatoes, cherries, and melons.
What I grow here in cantaloupes feeds about 2.5 million people their annual consumption of cantaloupes. And I'm just one farm.
Now farmers here in California's Central Valley are leaving 500,000 acres unplanted. Del Bosque is using what's left of his water supplies to keep his almond trees alive.
It was no surprise, but, reality does start to sink in now.
250 miles south in Los Angeles, produce distributor Jesse Martin expects a squeeze on the nation's supply of fresh fruit.
This time of the year, you can import fruit from other countries.
Yes, we do.
But when it comes to summertime,
there's no fruit anywhere else to import.
And vegetables, too. California's Central Valley grows at least 70% of the country's broccoli, cauliflower, and celery.
What's that going to do to prices?
Prices going to go up.
Are we talking about just a few pennies more expensive?
No, we're talking dollars. If last year you were able to buy something for 79 cents a pound, well, you're going to have to feel that you're going to pay $1.29 or $1.49.
Several cities near San Francisco also rely heavily on the federal water supply. On Friday,
They were told they may only receive half of their water allocation this year. For CBS This Morning Saturday, Carter Evans, Los Angeles.
We begin this half hour with earthquakes in Oklahoma. It is an odd thought. The Sooner State is not exactly quake country.
Yeah, just this week there were 150 Oklahoma quakes, and this year, less than 2 months into 2014, the number is nearly 800. Some scientists blame gas and oil drilling that uses hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Jeffrey Kluger, editor-at-large for Time Magazine, is here with more. Jeffrey, good morning.
Good morning.
This is a pretty stunning number, isn't it?
It's a really stunning number, especially when you consider the fact that from 1975 to 2008, there was precisely one quake per year with a magnitude of 3.0 or over in Oklahoma. It's now up to 40 quakes per year, and you get all of those larger numbers are as a result of the smaller quakes. There were 2,600 quakes under 3.5 last year alone.
The sense I got from the article, though, is that it's not really fracking itself so much as the byproducts from fracking. So what is fracking? Break it down for us.
Fracking is a process of drilling deep wells miles below the surface and then setting off powerful explosives which fracture the bedrock, hence the term fracking, and allow access to trapped oil and gas. Now that in itself you would think would be a destabilizing process, but in order to hold those fractures open, they have to inject millions of gallons of water.
Tonight, Detroit's chief of police is applauding what this mother did and also the outstanding work of his own officers. This surveillance video of 3 teenage thugs shows what can happen when burglars pick the wrong victim to mess with. As we first showed you last night on Action News at 11, the teens tear down the back door, only to discover mom is on the other side, locked and loaded.
I let them know I had a gun once they was in the house, and they challenged me and said I don't have a gun. So that's when I shot off the first round.
Now this video has gone viral. Her husband, thankful he gave his wife this assault rifle just 2 weeks ago after a different break-in attempt.
If I haven't prepared my wife for this kind of situation, I could have came home to a family that was gone.
So what do police think about this mom defending her home and her 2 small kids in this way? The chief of police says she did the right thing.
She certainly protected herself, her young children that were upstairs in the residence, and she did nothing at all wrong. Even after the victim advised the suspects that she was armed, there was an aggressive attempt to continue to enter into her residence.
What happened Monday night on Woodrow Wilson included one of 3 teens dropping what we now know to be a fake gun. Nonetheless, it was no joke to mom or the cops that quickly arrested these guys.
The relentless follow-up, a sense of urgency by our officers assigned to number 10 certainly is, which is consistent today in what we see in the Detroit Police Department. Phenomenal police work.
2 of the teens are in custody facing charges and have a history of trouble with the law. 1 even has a prior gun-related arrest. The 3rd is out on bond. Don't forget, this is also a very big victory for the neighborhood, considering these teens have been causing problems there for quite a while. From downtown Detroit, Simon Shaquette, 7 Action News.
For more news, visit youtube.com/pigmind5.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. If you're just joining us for the first time tonight, I want to remind you that you can find Truth on the Tracks here at UCY.tv every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, here at UCY.tv. Now, before the break, I was discussing the Syrian situation and the fact that 85 foreign intelligence officers had been captured by the Syrian government. They belonged to Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. And these are reports coming from Al-Manar and Press TV. These sources have been relatively accurate throughout the Syrian crisis, whatever other allegiances Al-Manar may have, as well as Press TV. Again, they've been very accurate in the past. There's no reason to doubt them now. There's always this knee-jerk reaction to not believe Press TV or Al-Manar simply because of the Iranian ownership of Press TV and the Palestinian connections of Al-Manar. But there should be no doubt, considering the Anglo-American control of the Western media and the Zionist influence in the Western media, that these stations are no more biased than what we consider our own. And of course, what we consider our own is not our own, but that's another discussion. Last thing I wanted to mention about Syria is that we have reached a hallmark recently here in the wholly incompetent Salam Idris, the commander of the Free Syrian Army, so-called Free Syrian Army, what's left of it, has been fired. And the new leader of the Free Syrian Army is now Abdel Ilah al-Bakir, and this is the group's military chief. So Idris is gone. He's incompetent, clearly. He's fighting a losing battle unless the Western imperialists come to his aid. So there's that. Now on to Ukraine. Not going to spend that much time on Ukraine. It's all in the news as it is, and of course, as I mentioned millions of times, that's hyperbole, but many times is more accurate. That's what I meant to say. Sometimes these words just come out. But as I mentioned many times on this show, I record Truth on the Tracks about a week in advance. Not entirely a week, but about a week. So whatever information you're getting here, although light years ahead of the mainstream media, you are getting this several days after the fact. So we try to be as up on top of things as we can, but sometimes time just lots can happen in 6-7 days. But as the situation stands, February 19th, which is when this show is being recorded, in Ukraine, what we're seeing in that country is yet another destabilization, yet another color revolution style infiltration of people with legitimate complaints. Right? Ukraine is extremely corrupt in terms of its government structure, in terms of the bribery, in terms of the general corruption. It's pretty open. It's pretty blatant, the corruption there. This is the same in other countries, Romania, Bulgaria. In the more westernized societies, we tend to hide it a little bit better, although not so much in recent years. Nevertheless, countries like Ukraine, it's pretty out in the open. So I'm not sitting here and actually claiming that Ukraine is not corrupt. It is. But these protesters that we have, compare and contrast the presentation of the Ukrainian protesters in the U.S. media to that of the Thai protesters. Tony Carlucci from Land Destroyer Report, Alt-Thai Media or Alt-Thai News, did an excellent report called A Tale of Two Protests. And he actually compared the manner in which the Ukrainian protesters and the Thai protesters were represented in the United States media. The Thai protesters are represented as anarchists, as violent, as unreasonable. The Ukrainian protesters are presented as we've seen protesters presented who were being used in these situations before, as peaceful, democracy-loving protesters, young people fed up with the corruption of the prior generation and not content to live in that situation anymore. They're going out and they're fighting for change they can believe in. Right? Well, they're not peaceful and they're not fighting for change, or at least many of them aren't. I'm sure there are many well-intentioned people out there who've been duped, well-meaning idiots, as they say. But what they're doing, first of all, they're calling for more EU control. They're pro-European Union. They want to be further ensconced in the European Union. They're upset that their president took money from Putin, from Russia. It's one of the corrupt the charges of corruption and the charges of weakness and so forth. Of course, what Putin offered was a much better deal than what the European Union was offering them, but nevertheless. So what we're seeing is a power play here between the U.S. and Russia. Russia, of course, vying for more influence in Ukraine. In fact, if you read Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, you'll see that Brzezinski actually discussed at length the Russian interest in Ukraine. So if you want to understand that from the eyes of a psychopath, then please read Brzezinski, and you'll see the importance of this country to Russia, but also to the United States and the Western imperialists, the U.S., British, French sort of connection that we have there. So again, the protesters are nothing more than a color revolution. They are violent. We have seen them violently attack police. They have used firearms against police, and of course, there are actually reports coming from very credible organizations like Thierry Masson of Voltaire Network, and these reports state that there were around 3,000 Libyan or Saudi Arabian, or a mixture of both, agents that were brought in, jihadist mercenaries that were brought in from these regions, probably fresh out of Syria, brought over to Ukraine to get the violence going, just like they did in other places, just like they did in Syria, just like they did in Gaddafi in Libya. Brought them in to get the violence going, and get the violence going they did. We're watching the results of that right now. So it's something to bear in mind, to watch. Russia is not going to be content to go gently into that dark night, and the United States, of course, is not going to be content with their own slip out of the arena of total control. Of course, those of us who have a very deep understanding of what's going on in current affairs, we all know that this the situation is engineered entirely. This is not just simply a back and forth power grab between the U.S. and Russia. This is something more. This is a guiding hand that is setting the chess pieces in place for a confrontation which is much bigger than what many people may at first believe. We're talking about the possibility of Third World War of the thermonuclear variety. We are talking about a worldwide version of Nazi Germany in terms of the police state. We're talking about vast austerity and poverty and Agenda 21 style society. All of it worldwide. And again, these situations that I'm talking about, there is a jockey for power. Don't make a mistake about that. Psychopaths rule the world, and psychopaths want power. But because of the nature of the psychopath, they cannot help but fight amongst one another. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to take sides with you. They're certainly not. This is a situation in which you start to gain power, and they're going to join forces together to quash you because you are infringing upon their game, their zero-sum game, as they believe it is. But when they start to fight amongst themselves, it's important that we don't take sides with them, and we encourage them to fight amongst themselves, and we try to make it through. And we need to jockey for power as well. Instead of sitting on the sidelines and complaining about the problems, I've said this over and over again on this show, we need to get outside, we need to make demands, we need to get involved immediately. Not just waking people up, but trying to organize a mass strike with mass demands. But before I get into the mass strike issue, if I have a chance, I will get into the mass strike issue. But before I do, I mentioned the global police state. So I need to get into that because we've got some breaking information. But let me set the stage a little bit. First, right, we have, I did an article a while back entitled Ohio National Guard Trains to Fight Gun-Owning Domestic Terrorists. And essentially what happened was that in January 2013, there was an exercise that took place in Ohio, and basically, the stage was set as if there were. This is a scenario that was given in the training drill. That there is Second Amendment supporters, gun rights advocates, people who have expressed anti-government sentiment. They're considered domestic terrorists, basically. These people supposedly hatched a plot in a local school district with local school district employees to use biological weapons like ricin in order to promote a pro-gun philosophy. Don't ask me how that would have done that, but this is the scenario nonetheless. The scenario was supposed to involve 2 Portsmouth Junior High School employees working on the orders of some fictional white nationalist leader named William Pierce, and they were supposedly to have poisoned school lunches with mustard gas in order to make their point. What's funny about this exercise is that they've got biological weapons being manufactured inside the school, and that would require the activation of containment and decontamination procedures. This is for the training benefit, but also they have documents spread around the schoolroom, right, that has the anti-government sentiments, articles about gun rights or gun laws, and a note identifying this fictional William Pierce as the leader of the organization. They even have his name and his phone number, and he's identified as the leader on these notes. Of course, these are really brilliant terrorists that they've concocted here, because these supposed terrorists are apparently so smart that they can make biological weapons, but they actually go to a public school to do it, which of course we all know that public schools certainly don't have the authoritarian culture and the nosy spy culture that would preclude you from doing such things. Of course, I'm speaking with a heavy dose of sarcasm there, but that aside, that's the scenario. These documents came to light via an organization, a conservative organization called Media Trackers. Now, we have to acknowledge the fact that Media Trackers is a very conservative, Sarah Palin, Glenn Beck type conservative, Tea Party type conservative organization, and that they obviously have a bias. But this does not change the fact these documents are real enough. We've seen these documents, and it's pretty clear what was going on here. In fact, when Media Trackers asked the Ohio National Guard, and actually when Media Trackers spoke to the Scioto County Emergency Management Agency Director Kim Carver about the documents that they had, she said, quote, "I'm not going to get into an Ohio Army National Guard issue that you have with them." And that was the end of that discussion. So they contacted the Ohio National Guard Communications Director James Sims II and asked him about this as well. He said it simply was not relevant as to why conservatives may feel like they were targeted by being portrayed as anti-government extremists. And he says, "Okay, I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to quit this conversation. You have a good day," and he walks off. So that's your public relations department from the Ohio National Guard. They just simply don't care how you feel about their exercises and how you feel as you were presented. Now, of course, this wasn't just conservatives. This is anybody. This is anti-government extremists. You don't have to be conservative to be anti-government or pro-gun or the other number of things that were included on these training documents. Now, I brought that up because it leads us back to South Carolina. Right. This leads us to something that happened recently, and listeners to the show will remember back in late January I was reporting on a training drill that was taking place in Columbia, South Carolina. And this training drill was between the South Carolina Richland County Sheriff's Office and the unidentified units from Fort Bragg with the U.S. military. Now, the Ohio training situation that I just mentioned a second ago was also between domestic law enforcement and military, the Ohio National Guard. But the South Carolina training situation that I just mentioned and I talked about in late January, again, South Carolina, the Richland County Sheriff's Office, and unidentified units from Fort Bragg. We were told by the Richland County Sheriff's Department at the time that citizens of the area could see military and departmental vehicles traveling in and around rural and metropolitan areas and may hear ordnance being set off or fired, which will be simulated blanks and controlled by trained personnel. Right? So this implies, although it does not state it explicitly, but it does imply that these drills were going to take place not necessarily on base, but off base, around the rural areas, around the metropolitan areas, and not to be alarmed. Now, I pointed out at the time, and I'll mention this again, but Fort Bragg hosts some pretty elite units, right? They have special forces, and they have some elite airborne forces, some elite aviation support units, and they've also got Delta Force. And of course we all know Delta Force because Delta Force loves kicking in the doors of American citizens. Delta Force loves killing American citizens. Delta Force, of course, has made itself a relatively infamous name amongst people who don't want to live in some third world gulag-ridden country, which Delta Force would be happy to enforce. But nevertheless, that was all the information that we had about these drills that took place in late January. But that is no longer the case, right? We have sources here that have explained that indeed special forces were involved in the drills with local civilian police forces. And they were working on some very disturbing things. Of course, the traditional police state drills, of course, they were setting up checkpoints, maintaining these checkpoints. They had other checkpoint-related activities going on. They also worked together to practice chopper insertion, which is basically deploying troops or operatives or whatever by way of helicopters. So, interesting activity for the police, right? But what is most disturbing about these exercises is that they were also practicing raiding farmhouses and engaging in domestic raids. And this was all the information that I was able to get, but that's chilling. Raiding farmhouses and engaging in domestic raids. So there's no wonder that Leon Lott, Richland County Sheriff, was so tight-lipped and silent about these operations, because maybe he didn't want to get out that he and his absolutely pathetic, awful department, Sheriff's Department, was involved in practicing killing American citizens, raiding farmhouses, and no doubt disarming them, and so forth. So that information is out now. So feel free to call the Sheriff's Department or not, doesn't matter, but this is something to be aware of. So the American police state only grows in its intensity. So while we're on the subject of situations such as this, right, such as emergency situations with police state and so forth, the recent ice apocalypse that took over the South and knocked out power for some people for 4 days, some of us 3 days, and some people had their power on the on the second day. But regardless, one of the things that we were able to learn, this was, again, I'm not trying to build the storm up to be something that it wasn't. In all honesty, it was just an ice storm. That's all it was. But it was enough to knock out the power for days and days for some people. And what we realized were two things. That, one, only a few people are actually equipped to deal with an emergency in a competent fashion. We also learned that there's a larger number of people, larger than the minority who are prepared, but still a minority in themselves, who are attempting to be prepared but actually fall short when the emergency actually happens. In other words, they have generators but they don't have gas. They have fireplaces but they don't have firewood. They have food but they don't have a way to cook it, etc., etc. So they're kind of half prepared. But the overwhelming majority of people are entirely unprepared for any slight disturbance. We're talking about people who eat out 3 times a day. They don't keep any food in the house. Who knew a winter storm was coming, because God knows they watched the television and listened to the radio day in and day out, so they knew a winter storm was coming. Yet they still didn't even bother to stop by the gas station the day before and fill up their cars with gas. Which is why the day after the ice storm, the convenience stores that had bigger generators and were able to operate the gas pumps, but not the credit card machines, who were operating the gas pumps, had lines a half-mile long in 3 different directions for gas the day after, till they ran out of gas. We actually had people coming up to me that I'd never seen before, asking to find kerosene, if I had any kerosene to give them. I'd never seen these people before. They'd never seen me, but they were already scavenging on the second day. On the second day, even though the gas trucks came in, the stores that did have generators, but again, no credit card machine, so it was only cash, the lines at the stores were visibly more irritated. People were jumping in line. People were, making sarcastic comments at one another. Kind of, you could see the tension building. And it only makes you wonder what would have happened if the power had stayed off for 3-4 days on a massive scale. What if it stayed off for a week or a month or a year? But what if it didn't come back on? What would people resort to? Well, I'm by no means a prepping expert, but I did an article entitled Half Prepping Equals No Prepping, Lessons from the Icepocalypse, which I wish people would take a look at, because they got 12 ideas of things that you might want to have on hand when you know that a winter storm is coming your way. But there's one other thing I want to mention, and I've only got a minute to do it because we're running out of time, but I want to mention the fact that in the 21st century, we have reached a point, and especially in the supposed most developed nation in the world, that simple ice storms or snowstorms or windstorms should not be capable of derailing the U.S. population in terms of power outages, especially as much as we rely on power. This is an issue of American living standards. This is an issue of national security, right? Our power grid is not really a power grid so much as a patchwork of these hastily strung together methods of creating power and providing it to the source. It's time to bury the power lines. No more stringing power lines in a temporary fashion. It's done, of course, because it's meant to be temporary, because they plan to take it down. Well, it's up to us to stop this kind of thing, and then it's also up to us to demand that the power lines be buried so we don't have to deal with power outages on these massive scales. And if anybody asks you how it can be paid for, it can be paid for by a nationalized Federal Reserve issuing 0% federal credit to states, to municipalities, to the federal government, even to companies if they have to get these lines buried. We can offer 0% interest credit to these organizations and institutions. We can give the maturity 100 years to mature. Again, 0% interest. We can get it done. It's not going to cause inflation because it's credit stimulus. And we should support municipal power, where power sources are owned by the community and provided to the community by the municipality, not private companies who are out to make profit. These companies gouge people power bills left and right, especially Puke Energy, which has also polluted 2 different environmental areas in North Carolina. We're running out of time, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe I can get to this next week, but this is Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
For more news, visit youtube.com/pigmine5.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.